today with Jane Day. Jane, do you want to explain a little bit about yourself, your role, and who you are, really?
Thanks, Hayley. Yeah, well, it's great to be back with you and to share with you in this space. So I'm Jane Day, and I'm a Baptist minister, and I've been in post, a new post of about 7 months with the Baptist Union of Great Britain as their Centenary Development Enabler. I'll perhaps say a bit more about the role later, but who I am, I'm someone who cares about people and encouraging people to be all that they're meant to be. I'm in a settling in phase at the moment, I say. So I was recently in South Africa before this post, and I had a great privilege of serving the Methodist Church, actually, as one of its mission partners. So I was in a space just outside Johannesburg, doing a big piece of work on encouraging women in ministry and leadership. So I was there for about 6 years. And then prior to that, I was in regional ministry, local pastorate, and I'm really delighted to be back in this space, serving the Baptist family. I feel like I've come home again, whatever home means, even though I am from Yorkshire and I'm living in London. So people are quick to say, well, that's not a London accent. Clearly it isn't. But yeah, that's a bit about me.
Brilliant, brilliant. So that's your role, the Centenary Officer. That sounds, enabler sounds it's quite a big title. So what does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, Hayley. I think, we must have had about 10 committees to decide on this job title, but I hope the invitation it gives people is to say, oh, that's an interesting job title. Tell me about that, Jane. So Centenary, basically, on the back of 100 years of ordaining women in ministry, which happened 2009. We appointed our first Baptist woman in ministry, Violet Hedger. She began training at Regent's Park College in Oxford. And on the back of that, I think, and I'm aware that the union still felt, Baptist Together felt that we were still moving quite slowly in terms of empowering and equipping women. So we've come, massively far, but we've still got a long way to go. So the role is about development, enabling, and some research to this particular role so that we can bring about a change.
Brilliant. So what have you noticed on your travels? I mean, we met at Saundersfoot in Wales when you came to the ministers' conference there, and you're frantically meeting lots of men and women in ministry. So what are you hearing? What are you learning? What are you seeing?
Yeah, again, just another great question, Hayley. So I think the first thing is that I've been very intentional about listening. I've quoted this before, but I'm a big fan of Stephen Cotterell's book, Hit the Ground Kneeling. So purposefully not tried to be rushing around, she says, and I have tried to balance with actually contemplative listening. So trying to listen to what some of the women are saying in particular, but also men, the churches, associations. And I guess one thing I'm observing, which might sound simple but yet profound, is that people want to tell their story, Hayley. People just want a safe space to be able to say, this is who I am and this is what's happening right now, whether that's male or female. The biggest thing I've observed, which I kind of knew in regional ministry, but I'm just fascinated by the difference in every association. And sometimes, I go to an association and they'll say, well, what ideas do you have for encouraging women? And whilst I might have a toolkit of resources, I'm very aware that unless an association or individuals or churches begin to own the agenda or the issue, whether it's about women or race or sexuality, any justice issue, unless we own it ourselves and do the theological thinking, reflection, that then we're not going to own it. So whilst I've got ideas and resources, I think it's about enabling those conversations to happen and say, well, what is God up to in this space? Because every context is different. and I share this in this space and other spaces, but, you know, I'm just fascinated when I look at all the Baptist Association websites, for example, and I'm like, wow, you know, how does the issue of encouraging women work in this context when we're very different and we have a diverse community? So I've noticed differences. I've noticed that there's energy for some things and not others. And yeah, noticed a real desire to kind of want to see change, which is encouraging. Yeah, and particularly, as I said earlier, that people want to tell their story.
Cool. Brilliant. So what do you, it's weird times that we are in at the moment.
Yeah.
We were just chatting about that earlier before we started recording. But what do you think, what are you hearing God say in these times? What's your testimony now, today?
Yeah, I mean, today I've kind of tried to make space again intentionally during these days of lockdown and coronavirus. And I'm challenged. I've been challenged in the role anyway to think about actually where do I put some of my own energies. And I keep coming back to the image of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, you know, on one level, I think it's very, what's the word? I suppose a bit indulgent to think about self-actualization if we imagine the pyramid. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong to be at the top or the bottom, but I've been using that image to reflect on women's needs. And in times of crisis like this, the thing that goes out of the window is any, not always, but proactive things or training or development, because people are focusing on the now, which is entirely appropriate. So that's led me to think, well, women who are surviving, struggling with basic needs, women who are struggling with domestic violence and abuse, which has increased significantly these past few days. You know, women who are struggling financially. I mean, it's even things like sanitary protection. I mean, it's as kind of basic and profound and hard as that. So I then wonder, in this time of crisis, how do we encourage women, if that's what this is about? Which, you know, feels a very different answer to when I'm sat with a group of women ministers who are talking about senior leadership, regional ministry, whatever we mean by senior leadership. How do they self-actualize and grow and develop into those roles? So for me, I'm in a, like everybody, a weird space, but we have the extremes, Hayley. So we've got women who, you know, talking to me about growth and development, personal leadership skills, access into different platforms. And then I'm very aware that there are women that I know that are being abused, as we all do, perhaps. And, you know, where do we put energy? What's the Spirit saying? I'm listening.
Brilliant. Okay, so there's a lot to kind of handle in that.
Sure.
Walk with in that. I wonder whether you've had various roles in local pasture, regional, and of course abroad with your work with the Methodists. What do you see God doing in a sense of mission over the years, and has that changed, developed? What have you seen in you?
Yeah, I mean, even the word mission I find interesting and quite hard to define. You know, my best example of mission was what somebody offered to me when I remember doing my assignment on missiology at college, training for ministry. And I asked a pastor at the time, I was doing a short-term overseas trip to El Salvador, and he said mission for him is he sees it with his eyes, allows God to speak to his heart, and then serves with his hands. And I've never forgotten that, Hayley. For me, it sums up kind of what mission is about. Being in Africa changed my whole thinking, I think, for 6 years. You know, people here, I remember when I left, we were talking about how to do evangelism, how to do mission. And in a different context, well, we never had to do evangelism or engage with it because the church was full every Sunday, and, you know, it was hard to get a seat. So when you're in a community of 500 to 600 every week, it's kind of can't say I had the missional conversation as such, although I did, but it was different. And coming back here, and I think the way my spirituality has shifted a little, mission for me is about being attentive. So how am I being attentive to what I think God is inviting me to do today or to be? And I still come back to that question. So I suppose it's, what am I aware of? Yeah, so I suppose in this role now, I'm aware that my understanding of mission has shifted a little, and it is about being aware. So what am I aware of, literally on a daily basis, of what I think God might be saying, and how can I be attentive to that? As a practical example, so in this role, I'm tasked with encouraging women in leadership across our denomination. And then I'm attentive to what I'm seeing and observing. So for example, with our regional minister team leaders, it's not a secret that all of them are men, with the exception of one woman. So if I'm being attentive to the spirit and we're wanting to see a shift in that particular direction that might encourage more women, for example, then I ask myself, well, is that an area where there needs to be disruption and disturbance? So it's not a criticism, it's an observation. So when I see that, how do I and others respond prophetically? Yeah, and I think it's about engaging with the imagination and saying, what if, let's dream together here, and maybe imagine a different space.
Brilliant. So taking that as a definition of mission, almost, do you think there is a difference in mission for the genders of men and women, and even those that don't identify maybe in those binary roles, or do you think it's okay just to do a blanket, everything's the same?
Sure, great question, Hayley. I think that then might be about a way of being, and how we approach mission. Does that differ because I'm either male or female? I've done more thinking about this. I think, is it a personality thing? I've done quite a bit, for example, around Enneagram types and who we are as human beings, and what that kind of offers the space. And I'm still reflecting, and again, during this coronavirus period that we're in, where we've seen much activism, is there something to be said there about the way that kind of men and women have responded? And I have seen this on different platforms on social media. Is that to do with gender? I think it is. And this is all anecdotal. I think I'm not in the space where I can, perhaps like others, speak hugely intelligently and say, well, this is a definitive, we do it differently. Yeah, I think we bring different skills to the table in terms of mission. I have seen differences in men and women, but I've seen collaborative ways of doing it as well. Yeah, it's a mixed bag, I think.
Brilliant. And just thinking about being a local minister, and what's that like, and how would you advise local ministers to encourage women in ministry and leadership?
Yeah, I would encourage local ministers to encourage, anybody in leadership, particularly women, by simply asking them to do something and giving them a platform. I often say that the reason why anybody is in leadership today is because somebody asked them to do something, and it's simple as that. And I would love to see more people being massively intentional and giving space for women's voices to be heard. Even as simple as, let's look at your local preaching plan, however we call it. I'm surrounded by Methodists, so I talk about the plan, forgive me. But how do we encourage space for, preaching on a Sunday? So are we being intentional about including women's voices into those spaces? And giving women opportunities to serve on various groups or boards or structures if appropriate. And I'd love to see more mentoring and coaching and allowing women to develop and to use their God-given gifts.
I don't know about you, but in this time, I'm finding it really easy just to go into navel-gazing mode and think about me and my circumstances. So in a sense of mission, I've been encouraging members of my church to look at where they see light, where they see hope, where they're seeing God's kingdom, just to kind of lift our eyes almost to heaven. And I wonder, if I was to ask you that question, where do you see those signs of hope and light and God's kingdom at this time?
Yeah, I'm seeing hope in, I'm seeing massive hope in creativity. So people perhaps kind of pausing and rethinking how might they connect, for example. I like your language, Hayley, of seeing light. And it's literally seeing a glimpse of, you know, whether that's people, you know, putting posters up in the window and just saying thank you to people or encouraging people. It's little things like, you know, really simple, but I'm hearing people connect on a WhatsApp group with their neighbours for the first time ever. And I hope that these small steps will lead to big changes in the future, whatever that means. And I don't think it's about a programme, I think it's about relationships. And we can't short circuit relationships in mission and communicating God's love. And I think this has given the church a brilliant opportunity to pause and pick up the telephone even, you know, and just have a conversation with somebody. So as I listen to those stories, I'm hearing hope. I'm also hearing hope in something that I have begun, and I, you know, share widely that it's partly my own need as well. But just to begin something called Circles of Connection, which I've done, and that's about giving people space to share how they are. So I've been meeting together online with various people and just asking one question, which is, how are you? And we've been holding silence together and offering a safe space. And that's given me quite a lot of hope. And I hope those kind of things continue, where people feel able to be free to share what's going on for them.
Thank you. And what have kind of been the challenges for you in your new role?
Yeah, challenges for me in my role. I think one of my early challenges was, I suppose I was a bit surprised, to be honest, Hayley. So when I came back, having been overseas, I found myself wondering if the kind of Baptists Together would have moved on with the agenda of encouraging women in ministry and leadership. And whilst I'd seen some growth, it felt that we were kind of moving at a snail's pace a little bit. So I was surprised that some of the conversations were similar, and it felt a little bit slow. It felt a bit like treacle, to be honest. Again, not a criticism, but just my observation. And I thought, oh, we're kind of still here in some cases. Although massively, we've seen huge increase with the amount of women, for example, going forward for ministerial formation and training. So that was a little bit of a challenge and a surprise. Other challenges, I mean, personally, just adjusting back to a cold climate, if you're interested to know that. And I'm still wearing jumpers, even in this season of spring. But that's a personal thing. But yeah, not too many challenges, I have to say. And I've been really welcomed back into the Baptist family.
Brilliant. Has there been anything since coming back that you've kind of really shocked you in the life of the church? You say about snail's pace in certain movements, but I just wonder whether culturally around worship and mission and ministry, have you noticed anything there?
Yeah, again, a great question, Hayley. It's one of the things I was overwhelmingly aware of when I came back. Was the demographics or the age profile of the church, which is probably not a kind of shock to people who are here, but I guess I'd been in a different space. again, it's not right or wrong, but I was just very aware that our congregations, our demographically age profile is very high, and it felt that to me. It was like, whoa. And I think because I'd been in a kind of an African kind of black community, where I was pretty much the only white person every week. So to come back into a church where I see everybody's white, I find that a bit shocking, a bit like, oh, is this how it is? Again, not right or wrong, it's just a space that we find ourselves in. And yeah, one of the interesting things I find is how time bound we are as a culture. I mean, I value time anyway, personally, but Africans taught me that they value relationships more than time. And I'm still sitting with that. So what does that mean? So for example, if I see an agenda where somebody's timed it and said, okay, you've got 3 minutes to talk about mission, 5 minutes to talk about this, I'm horrified by that, Hayley.
I'll note that.
I find it deeply offensive. But that's made me then think, I suppose my antenna has been raised with regards to other cultures, and I want to hang on to that gift. I fear that I might lose it because, they say it takes about 6 weeks for somebody new, for example, when you start in an institution, to kind of lose the initial observations and questions. And I think it'd be an interesting exercise for a local church, but if you get somebody new that comes to the church, make sure you sit down with them after 6 weeks and say to them, tell me what you have observed about amongst us. I think it's a great question. I think it's a great missional question that the church could ask. And for you, you're pretty new to this role, Hayley. I hope somebody's sitting down with you and saying, Hayley, tell me what you've observed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably a little bit less polite than you, so I just tell people what I observe anyway. So we've done a lot of that. What I love to do in a role is just kind of go, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Even if I enjoy it or if I don't enjoy it, I'm asking that question constantly. Why are we doing this? And unfortunately, so often we come back to, well, we've always done it this way.
Sure. I think that's a really interesting observation, and I'm delighted that we have people like you, Hayley, who are less polite, and that's a compliment, by the way. And there's something about kind of being brave and just bold and asking the questions, and that's an interesting shift that I think I've seen. I've come back into the UK culture and thought, people are just speaking out and they're asking questions and they're saying, look, I'm not putting up with this. So the Me Too campaign, for example, around gender stuff, I almost noticed aggressive is probably too strong a word, but, I thought, wow, these women are quite feisty. But that's because I've been in a space where women, I mean, you don't speak in some contexts in Africa, incredibly patriarchal culture where women were silenced a lot of the time. So that was interesting for me, making the switch back. It's like, wow, these women are speaking out, they've got voices, and quite right. And then, this part of men, I'd still love to do it, Hayley. I'd love to take a bunch of women over to Africa and say, let's reflect on women and theology and patriarchy and Me Too campaign in this context. And I am talking to a few people about that. So, I'd love to do more of that.
Brilliant. So can you just explain a little bit about your role that you had out in South Africa and encouraging women there?
Yeah, so the role I had was I was given a platform to develop and encourage women in leadership and ministry. So I kind of got the idea of doing a leadership program, I suppose, which I designed and developed called Magnify. And that was based on Mary's Song of Praise, the Magnificat. And I had one of those moments where my heart was just beating and I thought, what would it be like to see a generation of women and their souls kind of magnified? To magnify means to increase, to give space, to enlarge, to increase potential. And that was my deep desire for these women. So basically every Saturday I met together with groups of women. Over the kind of time I was there, I met with hundreds of women, literally, from different ages, context, background, black, coloured, white, which is how they spoke over there. And we just met together and did some equipping, empowering, talking about issues that affected women. I'm also a kind of professional coach and spiritual director, so I weaved those skills into doing my best, really, in offering a programme that would equip women and a generation. And, you know, it's still carrying on today, Hayley, which I'm delighted with. And yeah, it made my heart sing. I could talk for weeks about Magnify, and I'm very happy to do that. If anybody wants to know more, there are resources that I can offer to churches. So talk to me if anybody's interested.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And I think as churches, we're not good at sharing resources, are we?
Yeah, sure.
So it's good to know that there's stuff out there that we can use. So thank you for that.
Sure.
I wonder, in your ministry, if you look back, what kind of lessons would you say you've learned? What things maybe would you do differently if you were to start all over again?
Yeah, if I were to start all over again, I would be very intentional, which is my favourite word in the whole English language. I would be very intentional at finding the things that bring me joy, that motivate me to get out of bed in the morning and that are absolutely life-giving. And I would pursue them with intention and passion. And I would say no to other things. And I think I've tried to do that anyway throughout my ministry. But I would encourage every single human being to find out what brings them joy and to ask themselves how can they offer more faith, hope and love to the world, and then do it, Hayley. And it's as simple as that. And I would encourage that, because then I think the world is a better place, and to keep doing things that bring joy, and also to practice self-care. I am someone who takes self-care quite seriously anyway, and I don't feel guilty about that. I try to model it. So things like days off, healthy Sabbath leave, switching off from the phone for a 24-hour period every week, retreats. You know, I think it's quite important for everybody, not just people in ministry, lay people. So I'd encourage healthy patterns of attentiveness to self and to God.
Brilliant. And just if you were to speak to women that are in our churches, what one bit of advice would you give them?
If I were to speak to women in our churches, I would say be brave.
Brilliant. And what about ministers like myself? What bit of advice would you give us to help encourage women in ministry? You said about looking at pulpit plans and other things, but is there kind of one go away tip that we could do?
Yeah, I mean, the advice I would give to anybody, and you know, as you've asked me, I'd give advice to ministers on encouraging women, is to build intentional practices in their daily life or weekly rhythm that can do that. And it's almost like a spiritual discipline, you know. So we might have a spiritual discipline of reading the Bible or praying. What if one of our spiritual disciplines was to encourage another woman in leadership this week? And it's something that I try and model again, Hayley. So it might be that, for example, if I've read a really good book and I think this would be really good for this particular person, then, you know, I'll just send them a book. I might pick up the phone, I might write an email or a letter. But it's about being intentional and saying, okay, this is my practice. So every single week, and it's something that I try to do, is I encourage a woman in ministry or leadership. And there are various ways of doing that, whether it's phone, email, gift, or ring somebody else and ask them to make contact with them if I'm not able to do that. But intentional practice, build it in as a spiritual discipline.
That's brilliant, thank you. And just a kind of final one, how can we as an association support you in your role?
Yeah, how you can support me, Hayley, is I am someone who loves to be encouraged. I know probably everybody on the planet loves to be encouraged, but for me, that motivates me. So my request to people often is say, just encourage me, you know, and that might be a simple email every so often, even if it's once every 6 months, and just say, Jane, I just want to encourage you. I think you're doing a great job, even if I'm not. And yeah, I just like to be encouraged.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Jane. I think you're doing a great job.
Thanks, Ella. I feel encouraged.
But no, I think it is, and I think, you know, we as a team here in South Wales really noticed the positive impact you had when you came to our ministers' conference. You will see that in South Wales we're not great with women in ministry, in the sense of there's not high numbers, it's not a high proportion, and we're looking at readdressing that. And I know the women here sometimes have had to fight some really hard battles to get to the position. So you coming and listening and holding them in that safe space was really key and of real value. So I do genuinely mean that when I say thank you for that.